everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar on technology for accessible education. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that this will be a great experience in having you think a little bit about accessibility in order to make sure all of your students are able to learn. Just to let you know that this session will be recorded and posted on the U.S. Embassy YouTube channel so that you can re-watch it, or other teachers who are unable to attend can watch this session. Please go ahead and keep your microphones muted and your cameras off, but feel free to ask questions in the chat box, or if we have time at the end, you'll have a chance to unmute your mic and also be able to ask any questions. One thing that I do want to note is that I will be talking about different apps and technology organizations, and the English language programs nor the U.S. Embassy endorses these companies or products mentioned in this webinar. They are just examples of what kind of technology is available. Some of this technology is free, some may be free or have a charge. All of the ones that I use have at least a free version, because I understand that as teachers, we don't always have a large budget for having technology in our classes. And a little bit about myself. Hi, I'm Claire. If this is the first time that you are meeting me, I am an English language fellow. I work with the Tokyo Metropolitan Board of Education and the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. And I primarily conduct different teacher trainings, as you can see from these photos. And a little bit about my background and why I chose this topic. I am not an expert in special education, but as an English teacher in the United States and also abroad, I have had students with disabilities in my classes, and I have had to make sure that they were also able to learn. So I have done some of my own professional development, and while I don't have a degree in special education, I would say that I do have a good solid foundational knowledge of special education because of the students I've encountered in my own classes. So our objectives for this webinar is first for you to understand what is accessible education. Maybe this is a term that you have heard before or not. And I'd like for you to consider how you can use technology as well as your students use technology. If you're based in Japan, most of the schools now have one-to-one devices, meaning that every student has some device, whether it be, a tablet or a computer. And that is a really great tool and resource that we can leverage, especially for students who have learning differences. So we'll first define what is accessible education, and then we'll look at 4 broad areas. This is just an introduction, so I'm just going to be talking about each briefly. And there's a lot more out there, but this is just the surface. We'll cover the 4 areas of visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, physical disabilities, and neurodiversity. Now, in Tokyo, I know that there are special needs schools that are separate for students who have special learning needs. For example, students in wheelchairs or students who are deaf or hard of hearing. However, this doesn't mean that you may not have a student in your class who has some of these issues as well, perhaps in a more mild form. So let's talk about what is accessible education. But first, we can go ahead and in the chat box, you can just share and say hello, where you're coming from. So I would say, hi, I'm Claire, I'm from Tokyo. And do you know what is accessible education? Maybe you say, yes, I've heard of it before, or no, I have not. So please go ahead and share in the chat box where you're at right now. And is this a term that you've heard of? So Matsui Sensei, yes, you've heard of it. Awesome. I'm so glad. accessible education is really important. And please go ahead and share your responses in the chat box. Hello, Yoshi Sensei from Kagoshima. This is a new word to you. Great, also awesome, because we're going to talk about what this is. Hello, Yoko Sensei from Okayama. Also glad to hear. Okay, so you also haven't heard of it. That's totally fine. Welcome, Victoria. Okay, Natsuka Sensei in Fukuoka, welcome. Awesome, glad to hear that you've heard of it before. Great, so a few of you have heard of it or maybe have some knowledge of it, while a few of you it's the first time and maybe you haven't heard of it before, and that's totally fine as well. Hello, Michael from Hokkaido University. Neurodiversity students, awesome. So you already have some background in this or experience working with these kinds of students. Yeah, awesome. Hello, Yamamoto Sensei from Nara. All right. So you've heard of it, but don't know too much about it. Great. So the Council of Ontario Universities defines accessible education as designing materials and teaching in a way so that all students can access the materials and learning, including those with disabilities. So some of you may have heard of terms like universal design for learning, or accessibility. These are all related topics. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that accessible education and accessibility tools are not just only for students with disabilities. In fact, they help everyone, and perhaps we may be using some accessible tools in our daily life. For example, I use my phone quite often, and I actually have the text a little bit bigger than normal. And this is something that I do because I don't want to squint my eyes and have my phone close to my face. So this is a feature of my phone and of many smartphones where you can increase the text size. And this is actually an accessible feature. So people who maybe have low vision or have difficulties with vision, they may need larger text, but this actually helps someone like me, right? Another feature on my phone that I've used before for accessible education is the dark mode. Maybe you use this on your computer or my phone. I exclusively use dark mode, which means that the background is dark instead of light or white. And that actually helps me when I'm looking at the screen. This can help students with neurodiversity who may have difficulty with the contrast, or students with vision impairments. But it can help someone like me who I prefer to have screens with dark backgrounds. So why is this important? Making learning accessible for students is our job as teachers, right? We don't choose you will learn, but I'm not going to teach you, right? It may feel really overwhelming to address all students, but it is part of our job. And it shouldn't just be left only to special schools or special educators to help students learn. And then especially in the United States, one thing that we value is diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And inclusion is making sure that everyone can participate and have access. This is a very interesting and clear graphic from INEE that I think is really helpful. So we can see in this picture is exclusion. right? So this is perhaps society or community or a group. And exclusion is when people with differences are not able to participate, right? Perhaps someone who is in a wheelchair or maybe has vision impairment. Segregation is, okay, we are going to address the people who are not included, but we're going to actually keep them separate. So special needs schools actually are a form of segregation where there's a whole separate school to address them, but they are separated from the majority of society. Integration is when that group is a part of society, but they're still a little bit separated. And inclusion is when all people from all walks of life, diversity, backgrounds are able to participate in society. So let's talk a little bit about different types of disabilities, and then we'll jump into the tools that we can use. Now, the term visual disability refers to an individual with some degree of low vision, right? Some people maybe only see outlines of objects. Some people can see light. Maybe some people identify as being completely blind. And this also includes color blindness, right? I'm wearing glasses right now, which are actually blue light glasses, but I used to wear glasses in the past. And that is in some way my glasses when I was less able to see and had poor vision were an accessibility tool. Okay? So maybe some of you wear glasses or have students who wear glasses or have have difficulty with vision. Now, some people with visual disabilities use things like a cane or a service animal in order to support their disability and function in society. But it's not always clear when a person has a visual disability, right? So maybe some of our students may or may not have visual disabilities and we can't see that. So what are some things that we can do to support our students? It's important that, especially if we are sending things to students digitally, that we provide written descriptions of photos and visuals, right? We often have things like readers that will read out loud text on technology, right? We can do that now on our phones or on computers, but phones can't necessarily read photos or pictures. It's important to have contrasting and large text. So in this top example here, you can see it's pretty difficult to read, right? Even for me as I look at this, because this is kind of a gray on a white background. So the contrast isn't very good and the text is quite small. As compared to this, which is very contrasted, black with white, and the text is a little bit larger. Another point that I want to mention is be aware of using red and green together, especially if you are using them with some sort of meaning. Now, let's talk about the technology that we can use. This is for iPhone. This is my phone, and I took screenshots. Different phones and devices have an accessibility section. And one of those things is to change the text size, which I told you that I do. I like to have larger text so that I don't have to like squint and bring my screen so close to my face. But also you can have the device speak a selection. So when you highlight a piece of text, it will actually say that. We've I think seen a lot of that before where it reads out loud the text. And sometimes it can sound a little bit robotic, but I think it's been getting better and better. Now, here's a tool that is more new especially with AI. And this is something I'm excited to share because when I looked at this tool, I was like, wow, this is pretty amazing. So Seeing AI is an app, one example of many different apps that can either read short text documents, it can also scan barcodes and products, and it can provide a description of a person or a scene. So I'm going to go ahead. I don't know if you can. Okay, it's a little bit hard. I'm going to try and do this in a way that you can see. So I am taking a picture of my mug.
Processing. A person holding a blue and white mug.
Okay, so actually it tells you exactly what is in that picture, right? Which was a person holding a blue and white mug. And these are screenshots from the app itself that I did earlier. So I took a selfie. This is a 26-year-old woman. I'm so happy that they thought I was 26 with black hair looking happy. This is my dog. I took a picture of her. It says a dog on a leash, right? So these were pictures that I took and that it provided a written description. And as you heard from my phone, it provided an audio description of a person, scenery. You can also do this with currency. So if you have money, right, you can take a picture of the money and it will tell you how much money it is and what currency it is, right? So this is a great app that can support students who perhaps have visual impairments. But it can have many different uses as well, right? So this could be something that would be fun for students to use when they are providing descriptions of a picture. And then they can try and see how accurate it is compared to the app. So that's an activity that you could possibly do. Now, I wanted to specifically address color blindness. It's estimated that about 8% of men and about 1 in 200 women are colorblind. So it's about 4.5% worldwide. And so we should consider that it is possible that some of our students in our classes are colorblind. And in Japan, it's estimated there's about 3 million people who are colorblind. And in Japanese, it's, sorry, I'm going to try to read this. Shikikaku ijo. So this is an app that will simulate different visual forms of color blindness. So there are many forms of color blindness, but this app will help you see what it's like in the eyes of a colorblind person. So this was a board game that was developed by the US Department of State. And here the colors don't actually mean anything, they just indicate the different spots. But as you can see, some of these colors start becoming indistinguishable, right? Like here it's red and green, and here they look like the same color, right? In this form of color blindness, and this one as well. So this app, I think, is a really nice way to think about how can we make sure that we are being inclusive of students who are colorblind, and also thinking about like our design of presentations or handouts if we are using color for meaning, right? So maybe like the red spaces mean something and the green spaces mean something. But for a student who's colorblind, they won't be able to distinguish those two. Any questions before we move on to hearing disabilities? Please always feel free to add some questions in the chat box. All right, so hearing disabilities. There are a number of different kinds of hearing disabilities. And deaf with the uppercase D refers to someone who is part of an actual cultural and sociolinguistic group where their language is sign language. Now, we also have people who may consider themselves deafened, late deafened, oral deafened, or hard of hearing. And this is something that I noticed with my grandparents, right? As they got older, I had to speak a little bit louder. They also tended to not hear things at high pitches. So as we get older, we naturally lose our hearing, and younger people can hear higher pitches versus older people. So it's a natural part of our lives. But we may have students in our classes who have lost either all or some of their hearing. And so that's something that we may need to consider. And these students may be in special needs schools, but we may also still have students who have hearing disabilities, but either are not identified as having hearing disabilities or have milder versions, so they've kind of snuck under the radar. So when using videos, when using technology, I always advocate for using subtitles or captions. I watch all of my movies and TV shows at home with subtitles. I personally prefer that. And so this is something that does not help, that does not only help people with hearing disabilities. Now, something like this, Zoom has the feature to include captioning, which is awesome. So I always advocate for using that, as well as using live text. So I like to use the chat box as well. With helping students with hearing disabilities, it's important to focus on visual and textual information, speak clearly and distinctly, and you may also use audio equipment like a microphone. So when I was teaching junior high school back in the United States, I did have a student who had a hearing disability, and I actually used a special microphone that would amplify the sound in the back of the classroom and would actually also go directly into his implant, his cochlear implant, so that he would be able to hear me more clearly, as if I were talking right into his ear. Now, this microphone, I absolutely loved it because I felt like I didn't have to shout anymore or like project my voice. And it also helped my students who didn't have hearing disabilities, but perhaps at times had trouble hearing me. Now, one technology tool that you can use is called Microsoft Dictate. So
The bear and her cubs hungrily search the.
Okay, let me just go ahead and make sure this is shared for video and sound. Okay, so we can see this example of what Microsoft Dictate does.
The bear and her cubs hungrily search the forest for berries.
Okay, so that's just a quick example of what Microsoft Dictate is. It means that you can speak and it will record what is being said. I think that that's a tool that can be used for students with hearing disabilities. This is a free tool, so I just want to quickly show you. Here we go. So Microsoft Dictate is available in Microsoft 360, so you can dictate across different platforms. Right? I know someone who actually basically only dictates all of their text messages, which I find really interesting. I've never done that, but it's also a feature on many phones, right, where you can use the dictate button and it will type it out for you what you're saying. All right. So now I'd like to go ahead and talk about physical disabilities. So there are many, many different kinds of physical disabilities, including those that are mobility related, right? There's also ones that are health and medical disabilities, and some from brain injuries, and some are obvious, but some are not. And the other thing I want to say is some are temporary and some are longer lasting. So last year, I had injured my leg and I was running and I slipped because the grass was wet. I was running with my dog and I landed on my leg funny, so I like couldn't put any weight on it. And so I actually had to use crutches for about a month because I had this injury. And it was a temporary injury, but it really made me consider how accessible Tokyo is. And to be honest, Tokyo is fairly accessible compared to many other cities around the world. But it made me empathize with what it must be like to have a physical disability and be in society. Now, with some physical disabilities, you may need a wheelchair or a walker. For me, I needed crutches. But there are other disabilities that may not be very visible. For example, multiple sclerosis or arthritis. Okay. It may affect how someone can walk, stand, sit, move around, and even write. And it may be something that comes and goes. There may be like episodes of sometimes it's really bad and then it gets better and then it comes back and then it goes into remission, right? So uh, physical disabilities are very diverse. Now, maybe many students who have physical disabilities will be placed in special needs schools, but it is really possible that we have a student who, like me, gets injured and then has a temporary physical disability, right? So it may be important to allow assistive technology for writing, as well as include breaks. So maybe you have a student who plays sports and they injure their hand. And so they can no longer write. And so they may need some technology to support their involvement in the classroom and their learning. You can also use other tools that I mentioned before, such as Microsoft Dictate for helping students with physical disabilities. If your school does not have an elevator or ramps, as well as curb cuts, these are like when there's a curb and then it dips down so that you can push, for example, a wheelchair or a stroller. Please advocate for that, as that's really important. It may not be a student with a disability, but maybe a parent or a grandparent. And they may not be able to come to the school because of the physical barriers of being able to navigate the school. All right, this last category that I wanted to talk about, neurodiversity, includes a lot of different neurodiverse categories. And so there's a few that I'm going to focus on because they have to do with English language learning, but there are many more. For example, the autism spectrum, as well as other neurodiversities like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. These are three that may be specific for English language development, such as dyslexia, which is a neurodiversity making it difficult for spelling and recognizing different letters. Dysgraphia, which is difficulty around handwriting. and dyspraxia, which is difficulty with motor skills. It can also be known as a developmental coordination disorder, or DCD. Now, I'm not going to go into every single one of these, like I said. This is just an introduction. But if you have more questions, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A if there's a specific neurodiversity that you are interested in addressing or talking more about. So I'm going to talk about dyslexia because this is one that comes up often, especially when it comes to English language. And this may also show up in Japanese language as well. So with dyslexia, it is important to use images and diagrams. Writing in italics, underlining, and all caps also make it difficult for those with dyslexia to read. It's important to give extra time and to use friendly fonts. So I know that at least when I grew up, the font that had to be used was Times New Roman, size 12, double spaced. And that was kind of the font of education and academia. But actually what's found is that fonts that have serifs, which are those like little end pieces, are not friendly for those with dyslexia. So sans serif font looks like this, right? It doesn't have those little end pieces. Those are actually what you should be using in your presentations, in any handouts you give. And a tool that you can use to address this, there's a few different ones, but one that I wanted to mention is Immersive Reader. So here's an example of a text that may be in a presentation or in a document. This is a serif font. So you can see it has those little end pieces, right, that make it look a little bit more fancy and formal. As I mentioned, this type of font is not friendly for those with dyslexia. Now, Immersive Reader takes the text that you would put in, and then it outputs a text that looks similar to this. So this is maybe looks different and interesting to you, but you can notice a few things. The spacing is different. It's double spaced. The font is different. There are certain words that are in red. And you can see that some of the words, like example, are broken up with a dot in between them. This makes it easier for those with dyslexia to read the word. So let's go ahead and let me just pull up Immersive Reader so that everyone can see it. Okay, so Immersive Reader, this one is developed by Microsoft, and you can see that it changes the document and how it appears. And there are also ways for students to customize, and it works not only on the computer, but also on iPads and on phones. So there are things that you can do, like change the column width, right? So how much space is on the sides. You can also change the background color. So you can see sometimes white is not the easiest color to read. A white background is not easiest to read. And it can also focus on certain lines. So as you're reading along, it blurs out the other lines. Text spacing is also important, right? So this increases the spaces between the letters as well as breaking up the syllables. Now, Immersive Reader also has this feature of reading out loud. So you can use this not just, for example, with students who have dyslexia, but it's also a way to help increase auditory input and for students who maybe have visual impairments. One other tool that I wanted to mention is there's also different language settings for Immersive Reader as well. So if your students can use some Japanese in Immersive Reader as well. Some other tools that can be used include things like translator, dictation, and live captioning. These are all things that I have used before. And I just want to mention that planning in advance for accessible education does help all students. So now a lot of schools do use digital textbooks and students have their own devices. This is an opportunity for you to allow students not just to use the paper textbooks, but to provide options, right? Some students may prefer the paper textbook, the physical textbook. Some may prefer the digital textbook because they can zoom in and make the text larger. They can listen to the text being read. And so offering these different kinds of options to students and educating our students on these kinds of options will help them be able to access learning. And this is not just for, like I said, students with disabilities, but all students. So I, for example, really enjoy audiobooks. And so it doesn't mean that I have a visual impairment, but that is a way that I enjoy and access reading in some ways. Finally, I would like to share these posters that were developed by the UK Home Office. These cover some of the different design tools that I mentioned as you think about when you're creating PowerPoints or presentations or materials for your students. They go over some of the main things that that you may want to consider as you are designing these things. And I really like these posters because they are really easy to read and there's a lot of infographics. So let me just go ahead and pull up. I'll show you what this looks like. Sorry, this is taking a moment to open. Can you see the screen? So these posters have been translated into a variety of languages, including in Japanese. But this poster is the English poster. So you can see designing for accessibility. And then it focuses on things like for autism spectrum, for screen readers, low vision, dyslexia. So these are some things of what you should and shouldn't do to make sure that the design of your presentations or teaching materials is appropriate. All right. So here are my references. And thank you. So please feel free. I want to give this time now for questions or comments. And feel free to either unmute your mic or you can type the question in the chat box. Okay, so thank you for the question. My question seems to be a bit different angle, but I would like to ask you, how can you tell a student who may have difficulties to some degree from the whole classroom? Is there anything you can keep in mind to notice that? Wow, what a great question. So how do we notice if, say, some student is struggling or having, or maybe it's due to a disability or something else? And I think that part of this is going to be culturally dependent. And so I'll talk about from my perspective in my classroom teaching in the United States. This may be different in Japan or in other countries, but I'll talk about from my experience. So for me, one indicator is behavior, right? So if students are disengaged, they are acting out, they are skipping classes, or they are avoiding doing the work, these are signs that show me that maybe something else is going on and that there are some difficulties, right? So if everyone is sitting there writing, and then I have one student kind of sitting back or shuffling through papers or going to the bathroom all the time, that may indicate to me that something is going on. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that this student has a disability, but maybe they are having some difficulties with what is going on, or there's something outside of the classroom that's going on for them. Another indicator, I think, is academic performance. So when we are, for example, looking at different pieces of writing, as we gain experience, we start to see the trend of what is a typical skill level for students writing. And maybe I have a student whose skill is vastly below those of his or her peers. And so I always try to approach it with an inquiry mind. So asking questions, right? So trying to figure out what is going on here? Is this an environmental factor, right? Is there something going on in this student's home life or friend group or something else that's making it really hard for this student right now? Is it something in my own teaching, right? Is it something that many students are not understanding this, and so perhaps I have to change the way that I'm teaching? Or is it something within the student? So looking at the different factors that may affect student achievement. It might be something that is internal for that student, such as a lack of motivation, a disability, perhaps they don't have the skills yet and they are being left behind. So, okay, I will go back to the reference slide. I see that question. So those are some things that I would say. Other things that I might look for are things like if a student doesn't seem to be paying attention when I'm talking, I might wonder, is this an attention deficit disorder, or is this something to do with hearing? If I see a student is squinting or not paying attention, is this that they have low vision or difficulties with vision? So these are things that I may consider. I hope that answer some of your question, please let me know if there's a different aspect that I can address further. Okay, awesome. Microsoft Dictate. Microsoft Dictate should be able to work on any platform that uses Microsoft 360. So let me just go back to the question, PC. So it should work on both PC and iOS, Apple's platform. But it's typically used through Microsoft 360. But what I want to say is that Microsoft Dictate is not the only dictation app available. There are many, many different dictation apps, and many have now have that built in now, especially if you're using a phone or a tablet. They have that built in as a feature. I will add the links for Dictate and Immersive Reader in the chat box so you can check it out. Let's see. Yeah, I agree with you. Embracing diversity is important. And it can be very, I think as teachers, it is so hard. We have such difficult role because our students are really diverse. They are all so different and they all have different needs. And so we as individuals cannot, it would be it's superhuman to be able to address all of the needs of students. And so that's where I think that technology can help support that and do some of the things like address needs like dyslexia when we can't necessarily address that all the time. Other questions?
Hi everyone, I wonder if you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, hello. Sorry, I'm driving with earbuds, so my video is not on. But I do have one question. I'm just wondering how we can be a little bit sensitive to students who have special needs in the classroom, because especially teenagers might be a little bit shy if it looks like they are getting special treatment from the teacher. Do you have any opinions or advice on that, especially in a country like Japan, where maybe there is more of a focus on making sure that the whole group is doing the same thing in the same way?
Yes, that's a really, really excellent question, Megan, and thank you so much for asking that. Just to make sure I understand, you're asking, how can we consider students and help them not feel excluded or different? Especially in a country like Japan, where there is an emphasis on uniformity. I think that's a really, really excellent question. I think, first of all, we don't want to single out students with disabilities and make them feel different. And so I would not just go to one student and say, you're the only one that can use this feature of technology. Use this and do this to help you. What I would do is actually introduce these features to all of my students and let them know that it is an option. So what I mean is when we are, for example, everyone is reading the same textbook passage, but I can explain to students, oh, since we are reading this passage on our tablet, here are some features of the tablet that you can feel free to use to customize it for you. So you can change the background color. You can make the font bigger. You can use Immersive Reader. And so I'm going to present this to all of my students, not just my students with disabilities, because actually, like I said, maybe there are students who prefer to read with bigger font size, like myself, or who prefer a dark background or something like that, right? And so when I present this to all of my students, these options, these tools, as appropriate to use for all of my students, then actually anyone can use it, not just students with disabilities. And we're all going to be doing the same thing. We're all going to be reading the same passage, but maybe it looks slightly different to each student based on what they choose to do on their devices. I would also, when I am introducing these tools, make sure I'm clear about when they can and cannot use these tools. So I would introduce this tool, show students how to use it, and then I'd say, we're reading a passage. You can choose to read this on your tablet. Remember, if you want, you can change the background, blah, 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 and just remind students that that is an option. And maybe there are times where I don't want them to do that, although I can't think of a time where I wouldn't want them to do that, but maybe there are. For example, maybe they're doing entrance exam practice and they don't have the option of changing the font size and stuff like that. So I might say something like, okay, we can't use these tools for this particular activity. I see many hands. Natsuka sensei.
Hello, Claire Sensei. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. Your suggestion. So your suggestion is very helpful for me. I'd like to use your tools, and I agree with Megan-san. So many Japanese don't want to be acquired special helps. So I have been an elementary school teacher for many years. So sometimes I notice this student, this pupil needs special help. And I suggest to use special tools for them, but they don't want to use it. So because one of Japanese culture is in Japanese 比較の文化. So Japanese are always compared to people around ourselves. So I hope diversity and inclusion spread in Japan too. So I try to use your suggestion in my classroom. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comment. I think, like I said, there are very big cultural differences, and I don't want to say one way is wrong or right. I know that in Japan, as you said, it is important to consider and be similar to those around you, and that is a really big value. And so I think when you offer these tools, not only to the student who needs it, that you think needs it, but to everyone, then it becomes something where it's not taboo because one student is different. Then it's an option for all of the students. So hopefully that will help to address that. I don't think that there is a very easy answer to that situation. Great. So another question, Masaru Sensei asks, there are some dyslexia students in my school. They can't read and write even easy words. They lose motivation to study because they have lack of vocabulary. Do you have any good ideas? Wow, that's a really great question. And I don't think that there is an easy answer to this. but I can give some suggestions that you can perhaps try. I think that in the situation that you are talking about, it makes sense that students are feeling unmotivated and feeling frustrated, which can make it very hard for them to learn. And so I think first and foremost, we have to try and encourage them to be interested in learning English or a different subject, right? So we have to somehow build that interest. And so maybe we can include some pop culture references, some topics that they like. For example, if they are very interested in Pokemon or a certain sports team, those are things that perhaps we can include in our examples to get their attention. And we want to give them reasons for why they would want to learn English. Having them think about why it would be beneficial to them in the future is a good way. Now, with students with dyslexia, because reading and writing is such a challenge, you may want to first navigate it through speaking and listening first. And, you know, with dyslexia, reading and writing are going to always be a challenge because spelling is a challenge. And so using some of the tools that I have suggested can make it easier. I would recommend, because speaking and listening will be easier for them than reading and writing, I suggest they can use dictation tools to help with their writing, or to use the audio tool so they can highlight and listen to it being spoken as they read along. So that might be something that will help them a little bit more. But yeah, that is a really, really challenging situation. And you're right, they can't even read easy words because that is the nature of dyslexia, right? Is that even words that we would assume that students are able to read, they are unable to decipher. Okay, my students spend more time making slides than speaking in English during presentations. That's a yes, I've seen that. Yes, reducing the amount of time they have to practice their speeches. There isn't a question there, but I'm assuming that you're asking me to see if I can address that a little bit more. I think first it is important to, in any activity or assignment, think about what is the goal and what are you trying to assess. We often add all of these other things to our assignments and then lose focus of what is the goal. Is the goal for them to speak English? Is the goal for them to write? We may have many goals, but really trying to reduce down to what is the key essential parts. So if it is a presentation, and you're finding that students are taking a lot of time to make the slides, maybe you tell them that instead they should work on their speaking notes and they only have one slide that they need to use. Or maybe you just take the slides out altogether. So there's a few different ways. It depends on your goals for that. I think as well, I noticed that in my own classes, like when I taught English in the United States, I also had students who spent way more time like editing the video or like editing the slides, the presentation, than actually the content. And so a few things. One is if you have a rubric and you highlight the fact that it's not actually the presentation slides itself that matters, but the content and their speaking that matters, then you can help them see what is important. And then second, I think if you give them some time to work on it, or if you require, for example, a script or notes, this will force them to work on that as well. So that's just some suggestions.